Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, where we take a quick dive into the shadowy corners of history. The kind of corners where you'd maybe find a guy shuffling cards, sipping whiskey, and plotting his next great escape. Today's episode, it's a dusty trail ride back to the wild, wild west, a place where you could wake up an outlaw and go to sleep as a lawman, depending on how the cards fell. Picture this, Henry McCarty, a kid who began his life as just another face in the crowded New York slums. He somehow takes a left turn and he becomes Billy the Kid, an outlaw whose name still echoes in the myths of the American frontier. It's a story riddled with tragedy, betrayals, and jailbreaks that belong in a magician's playbook, and the kind of lawlessness that makes a modern crime look like a very tedious paperwork issue. From losing his parents to facing down hired guns, Billy's journey is a tale of survival, of dancing in and out of sheriff's hands, and carving out a name, or maybe a myth, that still haunts the American imagination. But before we get into the inevitable showdown, before we see Billy go from a hungry street kid to a folk hero and enemy number one, let's talk about the escapades that earned him his famous nickname. And, spoiler, it wasn't just because he looked young. So buckle up. Or, saddle up. The story comes with shootouts, secret alliances, bad poker games, and at least one sheriff who really should have taken up a safer profession. And don't worry, I'll leave the biggest twists hanging for the right moment because after all, Billy always had a way of keeping people guessing. The wild, wild west, a place where outlaws could become members of law enforcement overnight, or vice versa for that matter, and a place where many would carve out a level of fame and fortune that would last far longer than their own lifetimes. This was the case for Henry McCarty, son of Irish immigrants in New York City. No one would have expected the life that awaited young baby Henry in those formative early years, but there would be no mistaking the man that he would become and the legacy he would leave behind. Henry's life was marred with tragedy early on when his father died, leaving his wife Catherine and their two sons alone in the new world. It was more than likely that Catherine and her children had to live in the slums and on the streets of New York City before Catherine was able to find the means to move her family to Indiana. There, it would seem, their luck would change. Catherine met and married a man named William Antrim, who would also go on to adopt her sons. That was it. The foundations for a new, fresh lease on life had been provided for the now Antrim family. But for poor Catherine, it was too little too late. She began showing signs of suffering from tuberculosis, or as they called it in those days, consumption, a disease that was, at this point in time, a death sentence. Within a year of their fresh start, Henry McCarty was left an orphan. When Catherine, his mother, gone, her new husband William turned their back on her sons, and they were left with nothing, not even a place to call home. Taking pity on the now 14-year-old Henry, a local innkeeper gave him a bed to sleep on in exchange for work. Shortly after, Henry would be caught stealing food. Shortly after that, he and a friend were arrested while robbing a Chinese laundrette. Henry, however, managed to escape from jail by shimmying up a chimney. This was the birth of Henry McCarty, the fugitive, but he wasn't quite the man who would go down in infamy just yet. From prison, Henry escaped to his stepfather's house, only to be met with a cold shoulder. William gave Henry some money to get by, and then he showed him the door. Henry was off once again, officially out on the streets. He quickly fell in with some outlaws and began stealing horses from soldiers. It was during this time that Henry would be given the nickname Kid Antrim. This was one step closer to the man that would go down as one of the all-time heroes of the Wild West, but not just because of his young age. Kid was a common nickname for juvenile delinquents at that time, and Henry surely fit that profile. Shortly after he started selling horses, Henry was caught and arrested yet again. In a magnificent display of dexterity and brazen confidence, he managed to escape from prison, even though he was wearing shackles while the guards were out visiting a local dance hall. In an even bigger show of brazen confidence, instead of fleeing, Henry then returned to the same town and enjoyed a game of poker with a local blacksmith named Francis Wendy Cahill. But it wasn't showing back up in the same town he'd been arrested in, or even the locals ratting him out, that would get Henry in trouble yet again, but himself. Francis Cahill picked on Henry during this game of poker, and he reportedly accused Henry of being a pimp. Things then escalated, which resulted in Francis pinning Henry to the ground and slapping him. Quote, Billy had no choice. He had to use his equalizer. That's from one witness that later told the local law enforcement what happened. Billy and Henry and his equalizer, being the gun that he and blacksmith Francis Cahill had fought over. Henry then fled, leaving Francis bleeding from a gunshot wound to his stomach. Francis died the following day, officially making Billy the Kid a killer. Maybe believing that witness testimony of that evening would be enough to clear his name, he returned to town a few days later only to be arrested. He broke out of jail, stole a horse, and escaped to New Mexico before facing the courts. On his way there, Billy was attacked and his horse stolen by members of the Apache tribe. He was then forced to walk miles in treacherous conditions before finding refuge with a friend, John Jones. By then, Billy was almost dead, and it was only through John Jones and his mother, Barbara Jones's care that Billy survived. Without their intervention, the history books would be short one notable character. Now officially an outlaw and wanted for murder, Billy took to stealing cattle and horses, but he was caught yet again in Lincoln County. Here we see another twist of fate in Billy's story. He was caught in possession of horses belonging to John Tunstall, a rising businessman and cattle rancher. But instead of pressing charges against Billy, John hired him to be a cowboy and a gunman. But then John had a need for a man that could protect his herd, not just from predators and the elements, but from the competition. He and his business partner, Alexander McSween, were sworn enemies of Lawrence Murphy, James Dolan, and John Riley. In 1878, Alexander McSween owed James Dolan $8,000, which, in equivalency to today, is over $250,000. Alexander sent the local sheriff to John's property to collect $40,000 worth of property and livestock to cover what his business partner owed. Desperate to protect what was his, John entrusted Billy with 9 horses and sent him away. Only John could have more than likely have used the extra manpower, and this was a move he would come to regret. When the sheriff arrived with his own men to collect John's cattle, John rode out to meet and stop them. During the conversation that followed, a member of the sheriff's party shot John in the chest. John was knocked off his horse, but he was still alive. That was until another member of the sheriff's party got down off his horse, took John's gun, and shot him in the head. John's death sparked a fierce battle between men who had previously only been business rivals, and most notable of those who remained on John's side was none other than Billy the Kid. In what would become known as the Lincoln County War, Dick Brewer, John's former foreman, was granted the power to make arrests. He, Billy, and a number of men formed a group known as the Regulators, all of whom were deputized and sent out on the hunt for the now outlaws who'd killed John. Within a matter of days, they had captured 3 of James Dolan's men, but all 3 of them would die before they ever made it to the jailhouse back in Lincoln. Chaos then ensued, with gunfights breaking out on the daily, and both sides suffering casualties. Concerned over the growing turmoil, the governor of New Mexico, Samuel Beach Axtell, descended upon Lincoln. He then publicly reversed the decision to deputize the Regulators, and in one fell swoop made the entire party outlaws. This now meant that the Regulators were all fair game, but that didn't stop them on their quest to avenge John Tunstall. Only about a month later, a group of about 6 Regulators, including Billy the Kid, spotted the sheriff who'd led that party against John Tunstall walking down the street. They hid themselves behind a 10-foot wall and then opened fire. The sheriff was killed, but during the ensuing gunfight, Billy was shot in the thigh. He escaped and, unlike the sheriff, lived to fight another day. 3 days later, a buffalo hunter and cowboy, Buckshot Roberts tracked down the Regulators. Both he and the Regulators' leader, Dick Brewer, were killed in the gunfight that followed. This only added fuel to the growing fire. Now feeling like they no longer had to avenge just John's death, but also Dick Brewer as well, the Regulators put up an even fiercer fight. Both sides had heavy losses, but in the eyes of the courts, only the Regulators were the ones breaking the law. After one fight across Lincoln County lasted for 5 days, Army cavalry and infantry were sent into Lincoln to help keep the peace. They claimed that they were a neutral party in the conflict, but once they arrived at the house the Regulators were holed up in, they aimed their cannons at them and warned them that they would blow the house up if anyone fired their weapon. Seeing this, several members of the Regulators fled the battle, leaving behind only 13 members loyal to the cause. The local sheriff then approached the house, set it on fire, and demanded that everyone inside surrender. It was then that Billy the Kid rose up to lead what remained of the Regulators. Desperate to save his brethren, Billy sacrificed himself and created a distraction so that the other members could flee. In the resulting gunfight, most of the remaining Regulators were killed, and James Dolan's party claimed victory. Billy the Kid, however, managed to escape yet again, and rumor has it that he met with the infamous Missouri outlaw Jesse James on his way back to New Mexico. When he arrived there in early 1880, he posed for the only photo ever taken of him, and the only one that remains with us to this day. By the end of 1880, Billy was tracked down and pinned in his hideout. After a day of negotiation, Billy and his men agreed to surrender and were escorted into town to face justice. Court lasted for 2 days, where Billy the Kid's reputation as a folk hero was visibly and notably solidified as people all across town came out and see him and show their support. However, despite how the people clearly loved him, a jury would find Billy guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. To this day, he remains the only person to be convicted of any crimes in relation to the Lincoln County War. The story goes that while awaiting his execution in jail, Billy caught wind that his lover, Paulita Maxwell, was expecting his child. Billy then asked one of the guards to take him out to the outhouse, but used the excursion to attack the guard, steal his weapon, and shoot him. Billy then returned to the sheriff's office and stole a shotgun. From there, he took aim out the window and shot another guard on station. Billy stole a horse and fled. The very next day, word about Billy's escape spread far and wide, and a bounty was set for his arrest. He was tracked down by Sheriff Garrett at his home, where he was shot and killed at the age of 22. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I am Joe. I'm the host. Thank you for taking the time to listen. If you're a new listener, make sure you hit subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Any information you need about the podcast, you can go to 10minutemurder.com and you'll find it all there, as well as a way to contact me. And you don't have to go to the website to contact me, by the way. You can just send me an email, joe@10minutemurder.com. But the website does have all kinds of cool information there. And I'm not going to ramble on here, but I do need to let you know that I do realize that the time this is being released, it's Halloween week, and this isn't necessarily a Halloween-themed episode, but I'm working on one. It's going to come after Halloween, probably the next couple of episodes, and it was not planned. I went on a trip of sorts, kind of a little a road trip, when I stayed at a hotel in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and come to find out, that hotel has a murder history there. Well, one in particular, and supposedly the hotel's haunted. I don't know, spoiler alert on that. I didn't see any ghosts, didn't really expect to, but the hotel is fantastic. And the murder story is kind of cool as well, and we'll do that episode coming up in the next couple of episodes. I realize it's going to be after Halloween, and better planning by me, it would have been on Halloween that you would be hearing this, but my bad. So be looking for that to come pretty soon from 10-Minute Murder. And that's it. That is your episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder.